The prison murder of James Whitey Bulger. James Whitey Bulger was one of the most notorious organized crime figures in modern American history. For decades, he operated as the leader of Boston's Winter Hill Gang, involved in extortion, drug trafficking, murder, and corruption. But behind his criminal empire was a deeper betrayal. He was also working as an informant, supplying federal agents with intelligence on rival criminals while eliminating his own competition. By 2011, Bulger's decades-long run came to an end when the FBI arrested him in California. He was 81 years old. Sentenced to life in federal prison, many believed he would spend his remaining years quietly behind bars. But on the morning of October 30th, 2018, inside a federal penitentiary in West Virginia known as USP Hazelton, James Whitey Bulger was found dead in his cell. He had been beaten to death in a violent attack that appeared targeted, deliberate, and efficient. Within hours of the news, questions began to rise. Why was an elderly inmate with severe medical issues transferred to one of the most violent prisons in the United States? Why was he placed in the general population despite his reputation as a high-profile informant? And why did multiple security procedures fail at the exact moment they were needed most? The official explanation claimed the murder was carried out by inmates who held a grudge against informants. But the circumstances surrounding Bulger's death were so unusual, so synchronized, and so convenient for many powerful people that investigators and journalists began to suspect something deeper. Possibly even a coordinated effort to silence a man who knew too many secrets. In this documentary, we examine the events that led to Bulger's final transfer, the conditions inside USP Hazelton, the individuals involved in the killing, and the unanswered questions that continue to surround the case. We explore the theories that emerged afterward, including the possibility that Bulger's death was not merely a prison killing, but a strategic elimination. This is the full story behind the prison murder of James Whitey Bulger. A story of corruption, retaliation, secrecy, and the unresolved questions that remain. The final transfer. In late October 2018, James Whitey Bulger was being held at the United States Penitentiary Coleman II in Florida. For years, this facility had been considered one of the safer federal prisons for high-risk inmates and elderly prisoners. Bulger, who was 89 years old and suffering from heart problems, used a wheelchair and required consistent medical oversight. Despite these conditions, officials at Coleman decided that he needed to be moved. The reasons for the transfer were never fully clarified. Different explanations surfaced. Some staff claimed Bulger had threatened a prison nurse. Others said his behavior had become disruptive. Another version suggested that administrative conflicts within the prison led higher authorities to push for relocation. None of these explanations were confirmed, and the Bureau of Prisons did not provide a clear public justification. On October 29, 2018, the transfer process began. Bulger was moved from his cell, placed in restraints, and transported under high-security protocols. He was flown from Florida to Oklahoma, a common transfer hub for federal inmates. From there, he was transported to USP Hazelton, a high-security federal penitentiary in Brewston Mills, West Virginia. Hazelton had a reputation long before Bulger arrived. The facility had experienced frequent violence, understaffing, and ongoing complaints from prison employees regarding unsafe conditions. The prison was known for assaults, gang conflicts, and disputes that often escalated without adequate intervention. Many inmates and staff referred to it as Misery Mountain, a nickname suggesting a place where violence was both expected and poorly managed. Given Bulger's age, medical condition, and high-profile status as an informant, the decision to send him to Hazelton raised immediate questions. Standard procedure for inmates like Bulger usually required placement in a medical facility or a dedicated protective unit. Instead, he was assigned to a prison known for instability and limited protection for vulnerable inmates. When Bulger arrived at Hazelton late on October 29th, the intake process was brief. Prison staff noted his medical issues but still prepared him for placement. Despite the availability of secure housing and protective units, officials moved Bulger toward the general population. He was issued standard prison clothing, escorted through the intake corridor, and informed of the housing arrangements. By the early morning hours of October 30th, Bulger had been placed in a housing unit shared by inmates who were aware of his identity. Some prisoners later claimed that word of his arrival spread through the facility almost immediately. Others suggested that certain inmates appeared to already know he was coming. Within less than 12 hours of his arrival at Hazelton, James Whitey Bulger was dead. The inmates who were waiting. When James Whitey Bulger was placed into the general population unit at USP Hazelton, he entered an environment already shaped by internal tensions and long-standing inmate hierarchies. Hazelton housed members of various organized crime groups, gang-affiliated inmates, and individuals with violent histories. Among them were prisoners who had strong personal and ideological motivations against informants. One notable inmate in the same unit was Focio's Freddie Hayes, a former hitman with ties to the Genovese crime family. Hayes was serving a life sentence for murder and had a well-documented disdain for anyone who cooperated with law enforcement. According to several reports and statements from people who knew him, Hayes followed a personal code that strictly rejected informants. Bulger, who had been publicly exposed as a longtime FBI informant, fit that description more clearly than almost any other inmate in the federal system. Another inmate in the unit was Paul J. DeCalagero, a former member of a violent crime group from Massachusetts. DeCalagero, like Hayes, belonged to a criminal subculture that considered informants to be legitimate targets for retaliation. His presence in the same housing unit as Bulger added to the concerns about the risk level posed to the newly arrived inmate. Within hours of Bulger's placement, inmates reported that his arrival was common knowledge. Some prisoners said that the moment Bulger appeared in the unit, several inmates reacted with clear hostility. Others claimed that certain prisoners seemed unsurprised, as though they had anticipated his transfer. This raised questions. How did the information spread so quickly? And did inmate leaders receive advance notice? Prisoners often learn about incoming transfers through informal networks, but Hazelton's timing was unusually fast. Several inmates later stated that Bulger's name was being mentioned even before he was escorted to his cell. This suggested either rapid communication between units or the possibility that word of his transfer had circulated prior to his arrival. Hayes and other inmates with reputations for violence were located in close proximity to Bulger's cell. In a properly managed facility, high-profile inmates at risk of retaliation are typically separated from those who present the greatest danger. Yet in this case, individuals who had strong motives to harm Bulger were housed nearby, with no reported effort made to relocate either side. Additionally, Hazelton had been facing staffing shortages, leaving fewer guards on duty and fewer officers available to supervise inmate movements. Understaffing made it easier for inmates to coordinate actions without rapid intervention. Prison reports from the months prior to Bulger's death documented multiple violent incidents that escalated quickly due to slow response times. In this environment, Bulger's transfer placed him in a unit where several inmates had the means, the opportunity, and the personal motivation to act. What remained unclear was whether the situation developed naturally within the prison or whether conditions were arranged in such a way that an attack became almost inevitable. By the evening of October 29th, inmates in the unit were aware that Bulger had arrived. By the early hours of the next morning, some inmates had begun planning their approach. Within less than 12 hours inside Hazelton, the group of inmates with hostility toward informants had the access they needed. The combination of staffing problems, the facility structure, and Bulger's placement created a scenario where intervention became unlikely. The stage was set for what would happen next. The security breakdown. The hours leading up to James Whitey Bulger's death exposed a series of procedural failures inside USP Hazelton. Each individual failure could be viewed as an isolated mistake, but combined, they created an environment where an attack became not only possible, but predictable. The first issue occurred during housing placement. In circumstances involving high-profile inmates with known threats against them, prison officials typically assign protective custody or a highly monitored unit. Despite Bulger's age, medical dependency, notoriety, and status as a former informant, officials placed him directly into general population without any special monitoring protocols. The second security lapse involved camera coverage. Several areas within Hazelton's housing units had known blind spots, locations where surveillance cameras did not provide full visibility. These blind spots had been reported by staff before, and they were understood by inmates familiar with the unit. Bulger was placed in a cell located near one of these areas, where movement could occur without being fully captured on video. This meant that anything happening just outside his cell door was only partially recorded or not recorded at all. Another procedural failure involved the routine inmate checks. Federal prison policy requires officers to conduct regular rounds, typically every 30 minutes, to ensure inmates' safety and monitor activity. However, due to chronic staff shortages at Hazelton, these rounds were often delayed or inconsistent. On the night of Bulger's arrival and the morning of his murder, officers did not maintain a strict check schedule. This allowed extended periods during which inmate activity went unchecked. Additionally, a significant concern arose from the unlocking and locking procedures. In some parts of Hazelton, inmates were able to move between cells with relative freedom during certain hours. The combination of an unlocked cell door and weak monitoring meant that individuals could enter Bulger's cell with minimal interference. Reports later suggested that one or more correctional officers assigned to the unit were either absent from their posts or delayed in their rounds during the time when the attack occurred. While no official misconduct was confirmed, the absence of timely supervision contributed to the attacker's ability to act without immediate detection. There were also questions about Bulger's medical status. Because he required the use of a wheelchair and had ongoing heart issues, standard procedure would normally involve medical observation or placement in a facility equipped for elderly high-risk inmates. Hazelton did not have such a medical infrastructure. Despite this mismatch, Bulger remained in a general housing unit with limited medical oversight. The cumulative effect of these failures meant that when the attackers approached Bulger's cell early on October 30th, they encountered few obstacles. There was no officer actively monitoring the unit. No rapid response capability existed nearby. The surveillance coverage was incomplete, and the cell placement provided concealment. In a secure environment, such a coordinated attack would have been difficult to execute. At Hazelton, under the specific conditions surrounding Bulger's arrival, the attack required little more than opportunity. Within hours of being placed into the unit, the security measures that should have protected him had either collapsed or been bypassed entirely. By the time staff realized what had occurred, the attackers had already completed the assault. The killing. In the early hours of October 30th, 2018, activity within the housing unit at USP Hazelton began to follow its usual morning pattern. Inmates were awake before dawn, moving quietly inside their cells or preparing for the initial head count. During this period, guard presence was typically minimal, and inmate movements were less supervised. At approximately 6 a.m., a small group of inmates approached the corridor where James Whitey Bulger had been placed. Accounts later indicated that at least 3 individuals were involved, including Focio's Freddie Hayes and Paul J. DeCollegiero. These men were familiar with the blind spots in the unit's camera system and understood the timing of officer rounds. Their approach to Bulger's cell took place during a window when staff were not present on the range. Bulger's cell door was unlocked, consistent with the unit's standard procedures during early morning hours. The attackers entered the cell quickly. Reports from investigators, as well as descriptions given by prison staff, stated that the assault was carried out using a padlock placed inside a sock, a common improvised weapon in federal prisons. This type of weapon is capable of inflicting severe blunt force trauma with minimal noise. The attack was swift. Because Bulger was elderly, physically weak, and reliant on a wheelchair, he had limited ability to defend himself. The assailants delivered repeated blows to his head and face, causing catastrophic injuries. Medical examiners later concluded that the attack resulted in multiple skull fractures, severe facial trauma, and rapid loss of consciousness. No guards were present in the unit at the time of the assault. The lack of officer supervision allowed the attackers to carry out the homicide without interruption. The entire attack is believed to have taken several minutes, although the exact duration remains uncertain due to inconsistent surveillance coverage and gaps in officer observation. After the beating, the inmates exited the cell and returned to their respective areas within the unit. Because of the blind spots in the camera system, much of their movement went unrecorded. Other inmates in the area later reported hearing movement and activity, but did not intervene. In prison environments, especially those with gang affiliations, it is common for inmates to avoid involvement in conflicts that do not directly concern them. Approximately an hour later, during routine morning procedures, correctional officers discovered Bulger unresponsive in his cell. He was found lying in his bed, covered in blood, with injuries inconsistent with any accidental cause. Medical staff were summoned, but Bulger was pronounced dead shortly after their arrival. The response that followed was procedural but slow. Officers secured the unit, initiated the standard lockdown, and escorted inmates to designated holding areas. Investigators began reviewing camera footage, conducting interviews, and assessing the scene. However, the limitations of the surveillance system and the lack of reliable witness statements made it difficult to reconstruct the exact sequence of events. Although the attack was brutal, it appeared organized and purposeful. There were no signs of a struggle extending beyond the cell. There was no evidence of robbery or personal confrontation. The nature of the injuries indicated an intent to kill rather than intimidate or threaten. By mid-morning, prison officials notified the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the FBI that a homicide had occurred. The news of Bulger's death spread quickly across the country, prompting immediate public speculation due to his notoriety and the unusual circumstances surrounding his transfer and placement. The homicide marked the violent end of one of the most infamous criminal figures in the United States. But the events leading up to the attack and the number of unanswered questions sparked deeper scrutiny into whether the killing was simply an inmate retaliation or something more complex. Who really wanted him dead? After the murder of James Whitey Bulger, the official explanation presented by authorities was straightforward. Inmates who despised informants targeted him because of his history of cooperating with law enforcement. While this motive was plausible, the specific circumstances surrounding Bulger's transfer, placement, and rapid death raised questions far beyond simple inmate retaliation. Bulger's past was complex. For decades, he operated simultaneously as a violent crime boss and as an FBI informant. His cooperation with certain agents allowed him to eliminate rivals, avoid prosecution, and maintain control over criminal operations in Boston. His relationships with law enforcement figures, particularly within the FBI, have been the subject of multiple federal investigations. Several agents had already been exposed for misconduct related to their dealings with him. Because of this history, Bulger possessed information that could potentially implicate current or former government officials, law enforcement personnel, and criminal associates. During his trial and subsequent legal proceedings, not all of this information surfaced publicly. Some investigators believe that if Bulger ever chose to talk further, voluntarily or under pressure, he might have exposed additional misconduct. This background created an environment where a number of individuals or institutions could have benefited from his silence. Another issue involved the timing of his transfer. Bulger had been living in a medical facility designed for high-risk and elderly inmates. His sudden removal, with little explanation, seemed inconsistent with standard procedures. When combined with his placement into the general population at a notoriously violent prison, his vulnerability became immediate and obvious. Some observers pointed out that Hazelton had been experiencing significant staffing issues. Understaffing made it easier for inmate violence to occur without rapid detection. Yet despite knowing the risks, officials placed Bulger in a housing environment where inmates with known hostility toward informants lived only steps away. This raised the question of whether the conditions that enabled the attack were accidental or foreseeable. Another point of concern involved the lack of meaningful protection measures. High-profile inmates with known enemies are often placed under some form of separated supervision. In Bulger's case, Almost every procedure commonly used to protect such individuals was either ignored or bypassed. Investigators also noted the unusual speed with which inmates learned of Bulger's arrival. Information typically takes time to circulate, but accounts from Hazelton suggested that several prisoners were aware of his presence almost immediately. Some inmates reported that individuals appeared positioned in anticipation of his transfer. The murder itself was efficient, organized, and carried out without hesitation. The attackers appeared to know exactly when guards would be absent, how long they had to operate, and where the camera blind spots were located. This level of coordination suggested prior knowledge of the environment and the situation. Though no official evidence has ever confirmed involvement by individuals outside the prison, the combination of Bulger's criminal history, the sensitive information he held, and the series of institutional failures surrounding his transfer created widespread suspicion. Many observers, including former law enforcement officials, journalists, and criminologists, concluded that the circumstances were too aligned to be purely coincidental. Whether intentional or the result of a chain of errors, the final outcome was the same. James Whitey Bulger, one of the few remaining individuals with direct knowledge of long-buried corruption and misconduct, was permanently silenced. The official record remains unchanged. The public explanation attributes his death to inmate retaliation. But the broader context suggests that multiple parties had reasons for wanting him removed from the prison system entirely. The question of who ultimately benefited from Bulger's death remains unresolved. The silence after the storm. Following the murder of James Whitey Bulger, the official response unfolded with a noticeable absence of urgency. While the event drew national headlines for several days, the deeper questions surrounding the circumstances of his death received limited public attention from government agencies responsible for overseeing federal prisons. The Federal Bureau of Prisons announced that an investigation was underway and the FBI was assigned to examine the homicide. Yet, the updates provided were minimal. Months passed without detailed statements, timelines, or clarifications regarding the procedural missteps that contributed to Bulger's vulnerability. The unusual nature of his transfer, the placement into the general population, and the lack of adequate supervision were noted, but no comprehensive explanation was offered. Inside Hazelton, staff expressed frustration. Numerous correctional officers had previously warned that the prison was understaffed and experiencing repeated incidents of violence. These concerns had been documented in union reports and employee statements long before Bulger's arrival. Despite this, little changed after the homicide. The underlying issues of staffing shortages, facility structure, and inadequate oversight persisted. The murder did not lead to the immediate reforms one might expect following the death of such a high-profile inmate. The attackers themselves were placed under investigation, but even in this process, progress was slow. Months passed before any formal charges were discussed. Some observers questioned whether delays were the result of procedural challenges or hesitations within the system to draw additional attention to the case. The lack of clear communication contributed to speculation that the institutions involved preferred the issue to fade from public view. Outside the prison system, public discourse around Bulger's death diminished quickly. Despite his notoriety and the unusual circumstances of his murder, national media coverage was brief. There were few follow-up investigations by major news outlets. In contrast, cases involving far less prominent individuals often receive more sustained inquiries. The rapid decline in coverage raised questions about whether interest was intentionally steered away or whether the complexities of Bulger's past made journalists hesitant to pursue the story further. Family members and legal representatives raised concerns about the chain of decisions leading to Bulger's death. They questioned why he was transferred against medical advice, why he was placed in a violent facility, and why he was housed in an area where known threats were present. Their inquiries received limited responses. The overall institutional reaction remained subdued. There were no major congressional hearings. There were no public disciplinary actions against staff. There were no detailed reports released to explain how multiple security protocols failed simultaneously. The silence itself became part of the larger story. In a case involving one of the most notorious criminals in American history, an individual who had been connected to corrupt law enforcement practices, confidential informant scandals, and decades of organized crime, one might expect relentless scrutiny. Instead, the response was muted. For some observers, this quiet reaction reinforced suspicions that Bulger's death was convenient for numerous parties. With his murder, any unresolved questions he could have answered about past crimes, hidden connections, or systemic corruption were permanently removed from potential inquiry. Within the prison walls, life moved on. The housing unit where Bulger was killed returned to its routine operations. The staffing shortages persisted. The same blind spots in the camera system remained, and the institution's internal challenges continued largely unchanged. In the broader context, Bulger's death became another entry in the long record of prison violence in the United States. But the unanswered questions surrounding his final days, questions left unaddressed by the very institutions responsible for his custody, ensured that his murder would remain a subject of speculation, doubt, and unresolved suspicion. The unresolved ending. The murder of James Whitey Bulger inside USP Hazelton marked the final chapter of a long and complex criminal history. For decades, Bulger operated at the intersection of organized crime and federal law enforcement, building a legacy defined by violence, manipulation, and secrecy. His arrest, conviction, and eventual imprisonment were viewed by many as the long-delayed consequences of a criminal career that had shaped Boston's underworld for generations. Yet the circumstances surrounding his death introduced a new set of unanswered questions. The abrupt transfer from a medical facility, the placement into a high-risk environment, the immediate exposure to inmates who had clear reasons to harm him, and the failures in supervision all combined to create a situation where the homicide was not only possible, but increasingly predictable. Despite the significance of the case, many of the key issues remain unresolved. No comprehensive explanation has been publicly provided for the decisions that placed Bulger in general population. The staffing shortages and security lapses at Hazelton had been documented long before his arrival, yet the necessary corrective measures were not implemented. The violence inside the prison continued largely unchanged even after the homicide. The motives behind the attack were attributed to inmate retaliation against a known informant. However, the broader context of Bulger's life raised questions about whether others might have benefited from his silence. His long history as an informant, his involvement with corrupt federal agents, and his knowledge of unresolved criminal activity meant that his death removed a source of information that could have had implications far beyond the prison walls. Investigations into the homicide produced limited public disclosures. The institutions responsible for Bulger's custody offered minimal transparency. The lack of detailed reporting, combined with a rapid decline in public attention, contributed to an ongoing sense of uncertainty surrounding the case. Today, Bulger's death stands as a reminder of the vulnerabilities within the federal prison system, vulnerabilities that can lead to deadly outcomes, even for high-profile inmates. It also highlights the challenges of uncovering the full truth in cases where institutional failures, complex histories, and conflicting motives intersect. As the years pass, the murder of James Whitey Bulger remains officially classified as a prison homicide, but the broader questions surrounding how and why it happened continue to linger. With many details still unaddressed, the case endures as one of the most controversial inmate deaths in modern U.S. history. The story ends without full resolution, leaving a final, enduring question. Was Bulger's death the result of inmate retaliation, institutional negligence, or something deeper that will never be officially acknowledged?